Hello, New York Giants fans. Welcome back to Everything New York Giants. I'm your host, Adrianna, also known as New York Giants Fangirl on Instagram and TikTok. And today I have a very special guest. I'm welcoming in Patti Traina, who is everything that you need to know about the Giants. Patti can offer it to you. She's a Giants beat writer. She writes at Giants Country. She has a podcast called Locked On Giants. So if you're ever looking for anything, she is the person to go to. So welcome, Patti. I'm so excited to have you.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
Anytime. So I want to start with a little bit of your history, because one thing that I've noticed with Giants fans specifically is a lot of us have like the franchise, have a rich history of our family and generations of family members being Giants fans, which is how I ended up being a Giants fan. Thank God I grew up in northern New Jersey and it could have gone the other way. So I always joke that my grandpa started things off right. So I'd love to hear from you how you became a Giants fan, if you were one from birth like I was.
Well, yeah, my late father was a season ticket holder. Gosh, I want to say going back to the Yale Bowl, maybe even before that. So he was a season ticket holder for a number of years. And he continued right up until the end of the old Giant Stadium. On a Sunday, my choices as a kid growing up were either to spend time watching football games with him when he was home, or go watch whatever horror movie or whatever my mother was watching. And I didn't really care for that genre at the time. So I
Mm.
would go and I would spend time with my dad and watch football games. I'm a daddy's girl. I'm not ashamed to admit that. So we would go and I would, watch the games with him and ask questions, and he would explain it to me. And I would watch how passionate he got and how excited he would get, or how disappointed he would get, or angry, or whatever. And I would start to mirror that, like I didn't understand why I was getting angry or excited. I just did because, he was doing it. But as I got older, I developed an appreciation for the game. I became a fan of the sport and of the team. And when I was about, how old was I? It was 1979. So I don't remember how old I was, maybe 11. Yeah, I would have been about 11 or so. That was when Phil Simms was drafted by the Giants. And I remember my father taking me to my very first Giants game at Giant Stadium. And I just absolutely loved the environment. I mean, it was just so cool. And we weren't even tailgating at the time. We would just go and we would hang out and have a great time. And then I became greedy. I wanted to go to all the football games. And unfortunately, I couldn't, because I also had a younger brother who wanted to get into the games too. And my father had a friend who used to go. So ultimately, though, as we got a little older, my brother and I would take two seats. My father and his friend would take two, and we would just, go to the games. And I braved bad weather and all that stuff. I sat outside. We had great seats in the old Giant Stadium, and it just became a really fun way for me to spend my Sundays during the fall when I could. And it's one of my fondest memories from when I was growing up.
Mm. I feel the same way. My grandfather had season tickets back then too, and ultimately gave them up with MetLife Stadium and the PSL and all of that. But as an Italian, it was Sundays was Giants and pasta, and that was our deal. And I have three brothers, so we also had the same issues battling for tickets and that kind of thing. So we always say that some of our best memories with our grandpa too were anything Giants related. That's what was his favorite subjects to talk about. So how did your love and passion for the Giants develop into your career that you have now with the team?
Well, I always liked to write. I mean, growing up, I loved reading, and I used to write short stories. I used to write poems, all kinds of silly stuff growing up. I kept a diary. I read a lot of authors, like my father. I remember when he worked in New York, so he'd come home, and he'd have a copy of the Star Ledger, and I would greet him by the door, and I'd be like, "Hi, Dad," and I'd quick grab the paper and I'd run with it, into another room to read it. And I always went for the sports section because I just, in addition to football, I also like baseball and hockey. So I would read all that stuff, and just, the more I read different authors, I began to identify, I guess, styles that I like. And I said, okay, this doesn't look too hard. I think I can do this. But, it does take some time to learn. It
Mhm.
does take practice. And then also at the time, remember, weren't a lot of women doing this type of work. So I had to find somebody who would believe in me and give me an opportunity. And I was fortunate enough to kind of, pave the way and find my way into the industry. It took some time, it took some sacrifice. I'm not sure if a lot of people would be willing to go through what I went through, but ultimately, when I started to get the recognition from industry people who said, "Gosh, you're pretty good at this." And I said, "Okay, I'm gonna commit myself to learning more about the game and getting even better." So I just, with that encouragement, I just kept trying to build up what I knew and what I still needed to learn, and here I am.
What are some of the struggles that you faced back then breaking into the industry as a woman versus what you maybe face now? Because obviously we've seen the way that the industry has changed. Obviously, it's not 50-50, but I can imagine that it's light years ahead of what it was back then.
Yeah, I mean, back in the day, it was the good old boys club. It was a male-oriented business, so, if a woman came along and said, "Hey, I wanna be a writer," your motives sometimes were questioned. It's like, "Well, why?"
Mm.
Why do you wanna write about football? Why don't you wanna write about arts or theater or music or something like that? I remember when I was in high school, I had a teacher, and, he was in charge of he was the faculty advisor for this school paper, and I said to him, when I signed up for the paper, I said, "Hey, I wanna be a sports reporter." And he looked at me and he goes, "Why?" He says, "Wouldn't you rather write about arts or theater?" And I said, "No, I like football, I like baseball, I like hockey, I wanna cover those sports." And he really, tried to dissuade me from it, from doing that stuff. He's like, "Well, you don't wanna do that because, the guys are gonna have the bad language, this, that, the other thing." And I was like, at that point, I was like, I wasn't gonna fight the guy. I was like, "All right, you know what? I just wanna write. I just wanna get my feet wet. I wanna have an extracurricular activity so that when I go to college, I can show the admissions board that I did something in high school
Mhm.
besides taking up space." And so I did that. I didn't like it. Um, I got close to football by being in the marching band, which is a
Okay.
whole 'nother story in itself. But yeah, when I got to college, I went out for the school paper again, and I said, "Listen, I wanna cover all sports, particularly football." And thankfully, they did not give me a hard time. They said, "Okay, you wanna cover football? We'll let you cover it." So they would send me out, to media days, they would send me out to games, events with the football team, and in addition to doing football, I did baseball, I did fencing, which I didn't know anything about, but I learned how to cover that. I did, tennis, which I wasn't really a big fan of, but I became a big fan of it because I absolutely loved the women's tennis coach. She loved me. So yeah, I covered a whole bunch of sports, in college, but my first love was obviously football, and, I think back then, I go back and I look at some of my clips that I did, and I was like, "Okay, I see where I've grown," but there was always one element that I was really good at, and that was getting to sit down with people and get them to talk, whether about their career, about themselves, just having a conversation. And thankfully, when I got out of college and I tried to, pursue a career with it afterwards, I found somebody who believed in me in that and said, "Hey, you've got a good personality, an easygoing personality, you're easy to talk to. Let's see how you do with interviewing pro athletes." And that's kind of how I fell into it in a way, once I was able to break through that barrier and
Mhm.
actually get somebody to return my call or return my letter and say, "Okay, we'll talk and we'll see about giving you a chance."
That's awesome. It's a great story. And it seems like, from where you started to what you're doing now, I mean, what you're doing now is everything and more than just writing and probably what you originally started doing. Um, what advice do you have for any women who want to get involved in the sports world in general? I think for, a lot of young women, especially in high school and college, probably have a similar experience to what you went through. And I felt something similar going through college as well. And even now, I still deal with comments of people saying, rude things that I don't know what I'm talking about and then some. So what advice would you give them?
Well, first, ignore the haters because there's always going to be haters. I still get them. And, the older I get, the less I care about that stuff because I know at the end of the day that I've done my homework and I'm not just putting out stuff just to hear myself talk or to see my name in lights, as I call it.
Mhm.
There's substance behind what I put out. I can't always, go into every little detail that I know, but I'll give you what I can. The second thing is you've got to be all in. And by that, I mean, I work with a lot of young writers. I've mentored a lot of young writers. You can't sit there and say, oh my God, I can't work on Sunday because it's my birthday or it's my anniversary or it's Christmas or the schedule is what it is. Do I like working on holidays? No. I mean, I was telling the story to somebody. I've been married to my husband for over 20 years. I've known him for over 30, and I have not once been around on the actual day of his birthday because it coincides with training camp.
Mm,
With my birthday's another one. My birthday falls during draft month. So
okay.
this past year, I wasn't around on my birthday. I had to go and I had to cover Joe Shane's presser. So, you have to be all in. If you're really serious about making a career out of it, you got to ignore the haters. You got to be all in and don't give up. Just keep at it. A lot of people give up because they say, oh, I'm not getting the traffic. I'm not getting the attention. I'm not getting, the traction that I want. You will if you keep at it and if you do it right. If you do the job the right way, which is to avoid the clickbait stuff, to be sincere, be yourself. Don't rip other people off. If you're going to cite other people, get them credit, obviously, and just keep at it. And if you do that, um, you'll eventually start to gain traction. I mean, on Twitter, for example, I have over 30,000 followers. That's all organically grown. So now I'm trying to get my Instagram account up to that kind of numbers, but I got a long ways
Mhm.
to go there. But yeah, you just keep at it, put social media to work for you. I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff that I can tell you. And it's interesting because I'm actually going to start a YouTube channel where I disperse advice to aspiring journalists and stuff, because I've been a freelancer for over 30 years. I'm now a published author on the Giants. So I'm self-made and I'm very proud of the journey I've taken now. Have I had missteps along the way? Probably. But for the most part, I've done the best that I can and I've tried to do right by those that I've come in contact with.
Mhm. That's going to help a lot of people. I think that's a great idea. I want to get into Giant stuff now, and I want to start with talking about Daboll because last year when you had COVID, you said that Daboll reached out to you personally and called you to check in and see how you were doing. And, that really stuck with me. I think that we've seen, as fans, we've seen glimpses of him showing, his human side, and he seems very authentic and very true to himself in everything that he does. And I'm sure you saw the video of him and Slayton a
Mhm.
week or two ago at camp. And for those of you who didn't see it, Daboll said to him that he was watching film from last year's games, and week one, Darius Slayton was a scratch, and Daboll was really proud of how far he's come. And I think that was a really good example to the fans of you really have to work for it in order to make this roster, and it doesn't matter where you came from, that anyone has an opportunity to make the team. But what we've seen from that, you've gotten to spend a lot more time with Daboll. So, what else, aside from his authenticity, do you think that players love about him and the other coaches? Because it seems like the other coaches are the same way with the players. Like it very much seems like that across the board, that that is who they are, and everyone seems to have a good relationship with each other.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the best way I can put it is they're kind of like one of the guys. So it's like Dable and the coaches are very open. It's a two-way communication. All right. It's not my way or the highway. It's not, okay, this is how we're going to run the game plan. And I don't want to hear any ands, ifs, or buts about it. They solicit feedback. And, I asked Darren Waller about, what he liked about being a Giant, or a question to that extent. I don't remember the exact question, and he talked about that, how their opinions and feedback is valued. And I think we can all agree that when we come across somebody who gives us that air of, I know it all and I don't want to hear from you, that's turn off. But
Mhm.
if you're working with somebody, even if that somebody has a heck of a lot more years of experience than you do in an area, and they say, look, I'm open to new ideas. What do you guys and gals think? I think that resonates a lot more because you're treating people like adults. And I think that's the biggest thing. When you treat people like adults and responsible adults and you give them a piece of ownership into whatever it is you're trying to build, they're going to want to see it succeed probably more than you want to see it succeed because now their names and their ideas are attached to it.
Mhm. They have ownership over it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think, in my opinion, I think that's one of the biggest things that we saw coming out of the success of last year, especially what we had seen prior to that. So I'm probably a little over optimistic going into this year, feeling like, they've made a lot of really good moves this offseason. So I know on your podcast, you did a couple episodes about strengths and weaknesses. And now after going through OTAs, and gearing up for training camp, I think there's a couple position groups that obviously we probably feel like are weaker than others. With that being said, is there any group that you're concerned about that you feel like maybe they might try and bring someone else in, maybe during camp to compete, anything like that to try and build up the depth or the competition?
I would say probably the outside linebacker group because it's pretty much the same group that they had last year.
Mhm.
Now, to be fair, I did a detailed breakdown of the pass rush, and the pass rush wasn't as bad as the numbers suggested. And Wink Martindale would have been proud of that, by the way. I think he would have been proud of the approach I took. But that being said, it's interesting. I just put out today a very ridiculously early roster projection, 53-man roster projection. And I think the outside linebacker group was the one that I said I would not be surprised if maybe they add somebody at some
Mm.
point down the line. It's not that they don't have talent. I think Kayvon Thibodeau and Azeez Ojulari, if they are healthy, they're going to be, monsters out there. Wink loves Jihad Ward. Who doesn't love Hottie? He's a trip. And then you've got Tamon Fox and you've got O'Shane Zimenez and you've got Ellerson Smith. And that's where, to me, I'm like, I have question marks. Ellerson Smith hasn't played a full season of football since 2019. He's had injuries his first 2 years in the NFL. Zimenez, I like Zimenez's attitude and everything, but he started off strong and then he disappeared down the stretch. And Tamon Fox started to see reps, but I want to see more from him. So I just feel like, I go back to the 2007 team and the 2011 team. They had 3 deep at least on pass rushers. Now, what the Giants have going for them now is, in addition to Thibodeau and Ojulari, they have Leo Williams up front. They've got Dexter Lawrence up front. But the more pass rushers you have, the better. And I just don't know that they have enough. But we'll see. We'll see once we get to training camp if they do.
Yeah, that's what I worried about a little bit too. And I loved Nolan Smith going into the draft. So I'm still a little disappointed that he went to the enemy, but we'll get over it. But I want to talk about Leo for a second too, now that you mentioned him, because I was feeling for a while that I thought they were going to restructure him. And the more time that goes on and the more depth that they've added to the defensive line makes me feel like he might not be here next year. What do you think? Do you think that, I mean, there's definitely still time to restructure him, but do you feel like maybe it's not going that way?
I don't think they're going to restructure him. There was a time that I said, oh, they've got to get that number down. There's no way he could play on that. The problem is that's how we got into this mess with him to begin with. They kept restructuring him, and that's why his number is so high.
Mhm.
So that's not his fault per se, because I believe in within a standard player contract, there's a clause that says if a team needs to get money for salary cap purposes, they can go ahead and convert part of the base salary into a signing bonus. I mean, as long as the player's getting what he is owed that year, it doesn't matter if he gets a upfront advance, which is probably better for him, or if he just gets it, as written. So there is a clause in there. I don't think a lot of people know about. The Buffalo Bills just actually exercised that clause with Stephon Diggs, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm.
So yeah, with Leo, here's the thing: he's getting up there in age. Still a very good player, but he's getting up there in age. Has a lot of mileage on him, and he's been banged up the last couple of years. I do think he wants to remain with the Giants. I think the Giants would like to keep him, but I don't think they're gonna splurge on him to where he's gonna continue being the 3rd highest salary cap hit in the league like he currently is.
Mhm. Do you think it's more likely that based on how this season goes, maybe they sign him to a new deal next year, maybe just a 2-year deal that's obviously less than what it was going into this year?
I could see that, yeah, but, look, Leo's also gonna wanna get be paid what he's worth.
Mm,
We all look, this is nothing new. Every player, you and I probably, anybody watching this podcast, we all wanna be paid what we're worth. Now, does that happen all the time? No, it doesn't, because our employers or the markets will say, "You're only worth this amount," which, is kind of a slap in the face, if you will, or an intro to reality.
mhm,
So, I do think, both sides will want each other, but yeah, let's get through this year and see what happens, because, maybe somebody develops and, or maybe they go in a different direction. You never know. But I would say right now, because Leo's getting up there in age, because he's got so much mileage on him, let's see how it goes. So the other thing you got to remember is he's been playing an ungodly amount of snaps on defense the last like couple of years. They're going to cut him down to more around the 60 to 65% of the defensive snaps, which is what he should be taking. He shouldn't be playing 85, 90% of the defensive snaps. That's just crazy. You're
yeah,
going to wear the guy down,
right.
and he's starting to wear down. So I think that's the plan for them, or for him. Cut down on the snaps. Let's see if you can get him refreshed and rejuvenated, because if you look at his stat line, it's decreased every year. He still has an impact. He can still influence plays for others, but the bottom line, is the stat production, and that's gone down.
Mhm. While we're on that subject, we have to talk about Saquon, and I'm not sure if people are sick of talking about him, or I feel like it's a mixed bag. Some people are, every article that comes out, they're dying to hear what's going on with Saquon. So I flip flop, where a month ago I was feeling like they're going to get a deal done, and then after he spoke to the media, I was like, this is not looking good, and now I'm like, maybe they're going to work it out. What do you think is going to happen?
For the longest time, I was convinced he was going to play on the tag. I didn't think it would get done. Excuse me. I have since, in looking at it and hearing from him, from talking to people, I have I'm more optimistic something will get done. Now, will it be the type of deal he's looking for down to the last penny? Probably not. But here's the thing I think people need to remember with negotiations. In this case, it's deadline driven. And if you're the agent, you would be a dang fool to settle for anything right now, because then it looks like you're leaving money on the table. So there's going to be discussion back and forth between the agent and the Giants. I do think come July 17th, on or about July 17th, Saquon will sign a long-term deal. And the reason why I say that is because you can, he can sit there and say, okay, I'm going to gamble on myself like I did last year. But he got dinged last year. He had the shoulder issue. And even though he didn't miss any time because of the injury, you're really playing with fire there. And isn't it better, by the way, if you have a multi-year deal with multiple years of guaranteed money than a one-year deal with only 10.1 million in guaranteed money? I mean, if you're Saquon, any deal you're signing, is going to be at least, I think, 24 million in guaranteed money because that's the sum of the two franchise tags. So doesn't it make financial sense at that point to say, okay, rather than 10.1 million guaranteed, I can sign and I can get 24 plus guaranteed? I mean, assuming that's what's on the table, which I
Right.
think has to be.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, there's the gamble involved. And plus Saquon has the injury history. And here's the other thing. I believe they've added new talent, to this roster.
Yep.
So this isn't a case where, like, remember how years ago Odell Beckham Jr. was the offense and everybody knew it? And,
Mhm.
even when Saquon first came to the Giants, he was the offense, everybody knew it. I
Yep.
don't think that's gonna be the case anymore this year. If everybody's healthy, that's not gonna be the case. And I just think that, that and also I could see situations where maybe the Giants reduce some of Saquon's snaps just a little bit. Like for example, maybe they say, "Okay, you know what, Saquon, we're gonna preserve you because we want you fresh for the whole year, so you're not gonna be in the third down packages. We're gonna put, I don't know, Gary Brightwell or Matt Breida in there." So, just all those factors I think are gonna come into play, but I do think, Saquon will sign a multi-year deal. I think, when he sits down and he thinks about it, it might not be what he wants, but, I think he'll sign it. And, if anybody says, "Oh, you're settling," I mean, you just got to look at the whole picture here.
Yeah, that's been my argument too, is people who still say that Saquon is the entire Giants offense. And I can understand where they're coming from because like you said, up until this point, he pretty much has been. But when you look at the wide receivers last year, of course he was the focus of the offense. And this year, it's not just the wide receivers that we have more talent. It's the tight ends, it's other backs. So I agree. I think he very well could end up signing a long-term deal, probably no more than 2 or 3 years. But I do think that we're finally going to have a more balanced offense, assuming the offensive line does what we all hope it's going to do.
Yeah, and here's the other thing with Saquon, this is kind of the same argument that I would make with Daniel Jones. If he signs let's say a 3-year deal in which they have an out after 2, and he continues to play at a high level, who's to say they don't rip up the deal, after year 2 and say, "You know what? We're gonna sign you for another deal."
Right.
If you're willing to gamble, that's a pretty safe gamble to take, but at least in the meantime, you've got guaranteed money more than the 10.1 million that the tag would have paid you. So, you got to be smart about this and not let emotions get in the way. And I understand Saquon wants to be respected. I totally get that, and he should be. I'm
Mhm.
not saying he shouldn't be paid, but you've got to look at it objectively. And again, we all want to be paid what we're worth. I think I'm worth $1 million a year. I ain't getting paid $1 million a year. So, you got to be smart about it and just say, okay, am I getting compensated for what I'm doing at a fair market value? Because that's the other thing. The market does dictate, what you're going to get. And I think, if he ends up with a deal, 14 million APY, that's above the market rate. Now, I know APY is not a good indicator of what a player's actual contract value is worth, but, most of that 14 million would probably be base salary, and, it wouldn't be such a bad earning.
Yeah, absolutely. I would assume that at that point that he would probably be pretty happy with that. I want to move along to training camp for a minute because it's hopefully going to be here before we know it. But
Yeah, don't rush it. I'm enjoying my 6 weeks off.
okay, fair. Um, There are a lot of underrated players on this roster. And the reason that I say underrated is mostly just because I think we probably don't really know what we have from them yet. And some guys that I'm thinking of are, we talked about Tomon Fox before, some of the other undrafted free agents who were brought in, like Bryce Ford Wheaton, who's been talked about a lot, but maybe we haven't seen, a lot from, or someone like Darian Beavers, who's coming back from an injury, and Micah McFadden, who we haven't seen a lot of. But if who are players that you are looking at or focused on during camp this year? Is it guys like that you want to see how they progress with the twos and maybe even the ones? Or is it someone like Jones you want to see, or Neal, how he's shaping up on the line?
Yeah, I think it's a combination. Obviously, you're curious about the rookies and how they're gonna, fall into shape. Some of these undrafted free agents, like a Bryce Ford Wheaton, You want to see how he actually looks once there's, not that fear of getting hit, because in the spring you really can't tell a whole lot. It's a
Mhm.
non-contact, non-padless, padless practice. So you really can't tell a whole lot. You could just tell basic stuff. So that's certainly something. But I think for me, the biggest thing to pay attention to is going to be the year two players. You need Thibodeau, for example, to really step up. He started to show he could step up, but you need him to start finishing plays, something he admitted that he needs to do. You want Xavier McKinney to stay healthy and to start making some game-changing plays, which he had no interceptions last year, which is kind of crazy if you think about it.
Yeah.
You want Evan Neal to be better. So you want some of those year two guys to really step up. Dane Belton, is he going to be able to fill in at safety if he gets the starting job, or what's going to be his role? Cordell Flott, who I think is going to compete for the slot position this
Mhm.
year. So that's really the key group, I think. If you're breaking down the roster and saying, okay, where should I put my focus on? The improvement of year two, because the rookies are going to make mistakes. They're going to get better as they go along, but in training camp, they're going to make mistakes.
Mhm.
The year two guys now, they got to take their game from up here to here.
Yeah. I want to touch on injuries really quickly because I know we're going to run out of time in a minute. Joe Shane had mentioned that in the offseason that they were going to do a deep dive into the injuries to try and figure out, what really was causing them, especially when we play on the same turf as the Jets and they didn't have the type of injuries that we did. Is there anything that you've noticed that's been done differently at OTAs, or do you expect any changes to be done at camp, or do you think it's more internal?
I think it's a combination of the two. And for what it's worth, I think I asked that question of, I want to say, I think I asked it of Daboll. It might have been. I am going to ask it again when they open up training camp, when it's Daboll and Shane, because I'm very curious as to what they
Mhm.
might have found. Now, I don't know if they're going to answer it, but I think it's a question that needs to be asked because, obviously, they changed out the turf. And the
Yep.
turf, having stood on it in the field house, it does feel more like grass. It's kind of, it's weird.
Oh,
It's like uneven. And the way I
okay.
could tell is, when I used to stand on that turf, um, I would be fine, but whereas when I stand on grass, sometimes I feel it in my lower back. And after
Mhm.
standing on that turf for a while, I was feeling it. So I was like, okay, this is kind of like grass.
That's so
But yeah, part of the thing though with injuries is it's just bad luck. I mean,
yeah.
football's a violent sport. You're going to have broken bones. Unfortunately, somebody's going to roll up on your leg and your knee's going to go one way and your body's going to go the other way. And it's, not necessarily the way that you want it to.
Mhm.
So, the thing though that I think they need to address are the soft tissue issues that they were having, the calves, the groins, the hamstrings.
The
So
ham.
that is something I'm going to ask about because I am curious about it. Trust me, it's in my notebook. I just had my notebook actually here where I was writing down things as they come to me, things that I want to know for the summertime. So I'm getting a head start on my work.
I think that's a big question for all of us as fans too, is that when you look at guys like Waller and Paris Campbell, these guys who were brought in, it's the narrative is we can have an explosive offense if they all stay healthy. So it's such a big piece to it. And unfortunately, we have been at the top of it with the injuries. But I want to close out with this last question. Do you have any bold predictions for this year, whether it's roster cuts or
Mm.
wins? Do we beat the Eagles for once? Anything that you think is a little out there, maybe?
Oh, wow. Um, I'm not a big fan of doing game by game predictions this far in advance because we don't know what the rosters are going to look like. I tend to like to do them like the week of. Um, Roster cuts, too early for me to say. Bold predictions. This isn't really a bold prediction. I don't think. I think it's going to annoy some of the Daniel Jones haters, but I think Daniel Jones in his first year of that contract is going to justify why
Mhm.
he got paid. I know there are a lot of people out there who still think Daniel Jones is trash. I
Yep.
don't think that he is. I think you have to look at the big picture. But, look, sometimes people need convincing and seeing is believing. So I'm going to say Daniel Jones is going to throw for over 4,000 yards. What did he have with I think he'll hit 25 touchdowns because I think he had 24 in his rookie season.
Mhm.
I don't know if the interception rate is going to be, low again. I think it might increase as they do more deep downfield passes.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think Daniel Jones is I'm going to say he's going to finish as a top 10 quarterback. How's that for a bold prediction?
I love it. I feel the same way about Jones. I really feel like he finally has the pieces around him, and we're going to see him light it up this year, which I can only hope is what will happen. But thank you so much for taking the time to join me. For those of you who haven't listened to Patti's podcast or read any of her articles yet, Patti, you can tell them where to find you.
Yeah, you can find me over on giantscountry.com, which is part of the Fan Nation Network, which is a Sports Illustrated channel. You can find my podcast over on the Locked on Giants podcast. That's over on YouTube, also wherever you get podcasts. So this week we're running guests. We have like guests galore, and I have guests coming up next week too, just to get some different perspectives on the team. So you can find it there. And we also have a really cool new program that we're running over on the Locked on Giants podcast. It's called our Subtext Community, where I can text with you guys, those of you who sign up, messages. So when I have alerts and updates and stuff like that, I can get it out to you. And I've been corresponding back and forth with several Giant fans who have signed up for the service. And I love it because without you guys, there is no me. And I appreciate, everybody who takes an interest in my work, in me, in the podcast, whatever. Those of you who bought my book, I thank you. And I just, I'm very humbled by the interest and the admiration that I get, which I'm not sure if it's deserved, but I thank you nonetheless.
Well, I think we can all agree that you do a great job. Everyone who follows around or who follows you on all of your socials and podcasts and writing. So thank you so much again. And we'll look forward to all of the upcoming episodes and articles that you have coming out.
Thank you.